As you can tell from the title of my book, New Orleans has a secret side. And I'm from New Orleans, and a lot of people who are from there don't even know all of the secrets of the city, which makes for a very nice career, I should say. So I'll start tonight by talking about just one of the very many secrets that the city has in store from a historical vantage. So from the Civil War until World War I, after lavish parades through the streets, private masked carnival organizations called Krewes retreated to theaters where they staged elaborate balls for family and guests. The oldest, most prestigious of these organizations are called Old Line Krewes, and they modernized Mardi Gras in about the mid-19th century, and they became carnival leaders. In fact, they became the leaders of New Orleans in social circles and in political circles. So as a New Orleanian, again, I don't know if you guys know people from New Orleans, but we love to talk about New Orleans, and we love to read about New Orleans. So as a New Orleanian, whenever I'd read histories about Mardi Gras, I was always fascinated to read more about the city's unique history. And it was Mardi Gras histories in particular that I found provided a really rich landscape for thinking through these really multiple and intersecting layers from which to view the past. I mean, Mardi Gras histories, they're cultural, right? They're also political. And you can look at them through labor lenses, through the lens of gender, also through the lens of politics. And the list goes on. But I also grew up as a dancer. And so whenever you read histories about Mardi Gras, there are lots of mentions about dancing from the 16th century all the way through to today. There are lots of dance practices in Mardi Gras histories, but what I found to be really interesting in reading all of these is that no Mardi Gras account actually talked about the dancing itself, much less what the dancing meant. And so I became really, really curious. If there's so much dancing that's going on, obviously it's important, but why was dancing seemingly so off limits and as secretive as these Krewes are themselves? So I'm not going to give away all of the secrets today. You can read about some of the really fun and interesting stories in my book. But what I am going to explore is the concept of how dance and the moving body really come together as primary tools through which Old Line Krewes made sense of the world around them. And this world, of course, was ever-changing. So let's take a look. Old Line Krewes were elite Mardi Gras organizations founded in the mid-19th century. They were mostly Northerners and mostly Protestant. And when they came to New Orleans, they were accountants and lawyers. But New Orleans in the 1850s was considered to be the Queen of the South. So accordingly, these men were very smart. They didn't want to be accountants or lawyers anymore. They decided to get into the cotton trade, into the sugar trade. One of them bought all the ferry boats and started running that trade. They got into tobacco and manufactures. Soon they became the economic leaders of the city. New Orleans culture, once they got there, was very foreign to them because it's a colonial city of European empires, right? So it took a little bit of adjusting for them, and they went back and forth to Mobile, where they had a lot of friends, and in fact, where a few of them had come from. So they enjoyed their new home. They became very prosperous, and by the time that the Civil War came, they decided to stake their claim with the Confederacy in order to protect their economic interest. Well, they lost in the Confederacy, and in fact, a lot of them lost their fortunes, and they lost their political power. But what they didn't lose was their social class. And this is what became really important for them because this is what they turned to after the Civil War in order to rebuild themselves. So, in this rapidly changing world that left them behind in many respects, they turned to Mardi Gras. And this is where their social class played out. And ironically, Mardi Gras was not their culture. But they took some of their northern practices that they brought with them. They took some of the Creole practices of like loosely parading through the French Quarter in carts and in horse carriages. They took some of the Mobile Southern romanticism and stereotypes of the Old South, And they took all of this and they brought it together and they modernized Mardi Gras into the format that we know today. So the format that we know today is masking. Theoretically, anybody can get a costume, make it out of whatever they have, go out into the streets and mask the day and the night away, right? They also invented closed parades. So anybody can also parade through the street, hypothetically, but they were the first ones to say, nope, 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 this is an organization and it's closed and you don't know who we are because we're all costumed and we have a specific route that we're going to go, and so this is a closed parade. So we have masking, we have parades, and then also those parades ended in very lavish balls. So this triumvirate makes the Mardi Gras that is still in effect today. So these Krewes that we know, and that comes from John Milton's word crew. So Krewes were these very secret, no one knew who they were, fraternal organizations. And the oldest, again, the first ones to emerge, were called Old Line Krewes. And in fact, in many ways, the Old Line Krewes are still the organizations that are the Mardi Gras moguls. They still have some of the most power and run Mardi Gras scene. So in the late 1850s, we have the mystic crew of Comus, again from Milton's Paradise Lost. In the 1870s, we have the Twelfth Night Revelers and also Rex. And then in the 1880s, we had the formation of the Knights of Momus and the crew of Proteus. They are led by crew captains, but each year, by secret ballot, you have one man from the organization who's elected to reign as king, or according to the crew, a god. And he gets to dress up and be the king, or in Comus's case, a god out of the crew. But it's really the captain who wields the power, and he is also masked. They all are. So they go every year through the streets in their parade, which has an annual theme, atop floats, and those floats in the Reconstruction and turn of the century were pulled by horses. They were really carts, not floats. And they were decorated and costumed according to this annual theme. And they would end up at the Tableaux theaters for these at the theaters where they would end up at the Tableaux balls. And these balls were for family, and then their guests were the other Old Line Krewes. Those were the only people who were allowed to attend these balls. So these parades literally and figuratively elevated the social standing of these Krewes among the city's citizens, right? But the balls reinforced the class status among themselves. So it's at these balls that I became very interested in learning more about them. What was it about these Old Line crew balls that was so important? Because the men were masked the entire time. But it seemed to me that this is where they revealed their most precious mores, their most precious worldviews and class values, their ideas, their group identity. So enter the dance historian. Most of the balls were hosted and held at the French Opera House, which is a Greek revival structure that was built in the 1850s. And unfortunately, it burned down in 1990, but it was in the French Quarter. And the Krewes transformed the inside of the French Opera House according to what their annual theme was. So they decorated it, you know, with ribbons, with flowers, with mirrors, with thrones. But they also then added something that was particularly significant. Over the orchestra seats on the bottom, they put a parquet floor so that the stage was then flush with the whole bottom. What this did was create a focus on the ballroom. So dancing was the highlight and the mainstay of the evening. It also means that everyone who came to watch, again, friends, family, the other Krewes, were relegated to seats up above. So the spectators, it was literally a spectator sport, were all watching the Krewes perform down below. So this was about performing status, being seen and watching each other. So the guests who came did not go to the parades. If you wanted to go to the ball, you were getting ready while the parades were rolling through the street. They would enter into the theater, greeted by committeemen who would show them to seats. The lower balcony you were, that means the more esteemed of a guest that you were, because you had a better vantage to watch everything. Also, the higher you were, it meant the more shabbily you were dressed. Supposedly, prostitutes put on nice finery and gowns and snuck into the fourth balcony, but I think that that's not really true. Anyway, so the lower balconies were for more esteemed guests, and then at the parade's end, the crewmen, who were again in costume for that year's theme, would end up at the back of the theater and come through the bowels of the theater onto the stage where they would perform tableau theater for their guests. Then they would march around with the presentation of their court, and the ball would begin then. So what happened in the ball? It was pretty complicated. I mean, there were a lot of different kinds of dances that unfolded during the night. So when the men came out on stage, they would perform tableaux vivants, which were like living, static pictures. Look at me, I am a character, yes. Then after they performed the tableau vivant, maybe they would have 2 or 3 scenes. Earlier on in Reconstruction, they did multiple very lavish scenes, and then closer towards the 1880s and 1890s, they maybe had 1 or 2 scenes, and then they moved on to the presentation of the royal court, right? They became very interested in selecting a queen to accompany that one masked god or king. And then they became very interested in selecting dukes and maids to accompany the queen and king. And of course, they became even more interested in having a grand march and then quadrille maskers dances for everybody to see all of this regalness and pomp and circumstance unfolding. So that was the presentation of the royal court that came after the tableau vivant. After that, there were call-out dances where the crewmen could accompany their debutante daughters of the season out to the ballroom floor, or special women that they wanted to honor. And usually this was like queens from past seasons or visiting very important women like Winnie Davis, who was there a few years. And they would come out and they would dance quadrilles, really exciting, sometimes waltzes. And then finally, for the remainder of the night, which took up a lot of time, and sometimes as many as 500 people were out there, it was called general dancing. And this is where the floor opened up for all of the guests to be able to rush onto the floor, couple up with the person that they admired the most, and go for a whirl in waltzing. So the old line balls started usually around 10 at night, and they went until about 6 in the morning. They just didn't like to dance at all, did they? Not at all. Sometimes the royal court was like, we're out of here, we're gonna go eat and drink, and then they'd come back and dance some more. Dancing was so popular that the younger sons of crewmen had to wait until their fathers died in order to be able to become crewmen themselves, right? So membership was willed down generation to generation. They got tired of waiting for their memberships, right? So they decided that they would form their own tableau societies that were just dedicated to dancing while they waited for the old line memberships to come their way. Dancing was very, very important. And so when I realized that there was so much of an emphasis on dancing, but the Mardi Gras histories weren't really focusing on this, I started to see something. Dun, dun, dun. And what did I see? I mean, there are a lot of Mardi Gras histories out there because I'm serious about this thing that people from New Orleans like to talk about New Orleans. And then if they can write, if they're historians, they're like, well, I'm going to talk about it on paper, right? So I noticed something that these other histories hadn't noticed. And that was that the tableau ball, which had been talked about ad nauseum in these other histories, had been sorely overlooked as a site of meaning-making. And it was a site of meaning-making for old line crewsmen. Dance in its many forms, from the tableau, which even though they're static, was a choreography, to quadrilles and grand marches, waltzes and ragtime that we're going to talk about. Even preparing for the ball is a sort of choreography, a social choreography, right? These Mardi Gras moments had been written off by lots of historians as just, moving this water bottle for you, as just entertainment, but they weren't entertainment. In fact, for crewmen, dance revealed the seriousness of play. Dance shows us where and how we belong in society. It functions as a way for people to experiment with social values. And it also stabilizes us so that we can figure out how to maintain the status quo. And it also brings us together, right? Helps us to make sense of the world around us. And that's what it did for old line crewsmen. It made sense of the world around them through a very formalized ball format. And I found that this format subtly shifted over time, even though a lot of historians think that it's don't lockstep. It's not. As the generations, as the decades, as the eras progressed, the old line ball format shifted. And that's pretty significant because it tells us how the old line crewsmen's worldviews shifted. So for instance, during Reconstruction, as the men were putting themselves back together, so to speak, after the war, tableaux were more important. So again, the balls opened with tableau performances where costumed crewmen on stage depicted images relating to the season's theme. So for Mardi Gras in New Orleans, these themes, or living pictures, which were enormously popular during the time, mostly as like parlor entertainment for people at home, they focused more on elaborate tableau productions, again during Reconstruction, and these were mostly focused on heroes of mythical proportions, right? And when I'm talking about heroes of mythical proportions, I'm talking about ancient Rome and ancient Greece, and I'm talking about ancient Louisiana. It has to be also a good dose of Louisiana history in there, right? Conquering the world. Also knights abiding by a code of honor and saving damsels in distress. And also a really, really good dose of political mockery, because it is, after all, Reconstruction. So because of this, as much as the parades hinted at these themes, the tableaux really perfected them. In fact, literally embodied them and expounded upon them in the safety of their own friends and family. So this is where the shared group values and bonding that I talked about earlier became legible and concrete. Take this tableau from 1870, for instance, and this is the finale from the History of Louisiana from 1539 to 1815. And that's the name of the pageant, and this specific tableau is called Louisiana, Her Founders and Defenders. And as you can see, all these characters are on various pedestals, and this is a huge endeavor. I think it's like 21, wait, I have it written down here, 35 feet wide and 21 feet tall. 35 feet wide and 21 feet tall. And that's the base of the tableau platform. And it's completely covered with characters, from Napoleon, Bienville to De Soto, and Jackson at the top. And we can see from this drawing by artist Charles Brighton that we have multiple statues that are white statues. They stand erect with open chests and feet apart. They are men with these firmly planted feet where they stand, right? Their bodies possess verticality. Their characters claim space. They even extend the space around them and thus their own presence. And if you guys go to ballet, these are the same kinds of aesthetics that we see in ballet. But for the sake of here, with these men, we see that they're extending their space by doffing their hat or with manly implements, guns, swords, staffs. They're strong, they're grounded. They're another ballet term, they're timeless, right? So on stage, these towering marble statues connected crewmen's image of Southern gentility to heroic deeds, to dominance, and to, in this case, to literal whiteness, all through grand scenes that relied on meticulously controlled bodies. So by powdering their skin with precipitated chalk and striking an elegant, noble pose, they attached male bodies to power, prestige, and cultural enlightenment. This is an 1873 pageant. 3 years later, Comus, again, The Missing Links to Darwin's Origin of Species, where the crewmen dressed as various animals in Darwin's evolutionary chain. We have sponge, mosquito hawk, elephant, baboon, and the main characters are all escorted by personal squires who were dressed as asses. Many of the animal masks, if you can see some of them, actually caricatured specific governmental officials. So that tobacco grub up there is President Grant. And we have Benjamin Butler, a real favorite in New Orleans, was mocked as the hyena. There he is stealing his spoons, if you know the history of Benjamin Butler. So as a satire, The Missing Links made visible crewmen's concern over racial politics. Comus presented its version of the missing link as a hybrid animal who was half black, half gorilla, and played the banjo. Comus's satire clearly pitted the crewmen against the era's two most progressive strands of thought: the radical Republican government, which had been instilled in New Orleans, and they tried to overthrow, and Darwin's evolutionary philosophy. Historian Mitchell Reed argued that, in fact, the crew held up the contemporary political and social order as unnatural. So these characters marched through the street in their parade, and it was funny, but to bystanders or themselves. But later that night, they were able to unmask their real seriousness without humor later at the ball. Their tableau enlivened their ideas even further, where we see that various animals, a beetle, a locust, and more, bowed to the gorilla and danced with delight. But one figure conquers the stage. Can you see him down there raising his arms? It's Comus, unyielding to the animals around him. And here he's making his point, that he clearly stands apart from the rest of the world, even from man's evolution, and the platform of Reconstruction. He rules by divine right. And as the audience drinks this in, the tableau shifts. The Daily Picayune states that, quote, "The arm of the grasshopper moves. A strain comes in from the fiddle. The music strikes a march. Beasts, fish. Bugs, birds, and creeping things start out upon the dancing floor. The living mass of the audience surges down to meet them, and the world is given for a ball." Once on the dance floor, alligators, gorillas, mock gods, and ladies alike intermingled for waltzing and conversation, furthering group bonds and solidarity through socializing and ballroom embraces. So as we can see, crewmen constructed powerful post-war images of ideal manhood and politics during a very turbulent time for themselves. But this power, these values, they weren't static, and neither were the statues represented on stage. They were very contested, and so were the ways that they performed. And this is what I learned in my research. By listening to what the lens of dance had to offer, Mardi Gras history became fluid. It became alive. Most Mardi Gras histories explored the social and political history of Mardi Gras, including the men who created the Old Line Krewes. Their affiliations with the paramilitary White League, their ousting of the radical Republican government. But often as readers, we learn about these crewmen in glimpses, like these tableaux, as fixed figures embroiled in their turbulent times, staking their claim with the Confederacy or later fighting the radical Republican government, and then, well, nothing. But if we look at their tableau performances, these frozen moments on stage, crewmen were anything but static. As Reconstruction politic waned, the crew court performances became more important at the Old Line balls. In the Gilded Age, focus shifted to mock royalty and a focus on debutante daughters who served as crew queens and debutantes. Guests wanted a different kind of fantasy, one less embroiled in war. They wanted regal glamour, fairy tale romance come to life, kings and queens. Masked as gods, kings, and knights, male courtiers symbolized extreme manly power. So court women, as you can see here, needed to reflect an extra elevated status too. Here too, of course, there was plenty of space for dance. There was a formal grand march and royal maskers dances, mostly quadrilles. Within this, the Grand March was a crew court main event, and it was the introduction for the full mass crew via geometrical floor patterns interspersed with bows and curtsies and scepter waves from king and queen, mostly like this. But they had to train for a very long time to do it. But also those mantles were extremely heavy, very heavy, and most of the time ordered from France. So they are interspersed with bows and curtsies and scepter waves from king and queen to all of the admiring guests who looked on from those balconies we saw earlier in the French Opera House. The Grand March was important because what it did was it conveyed the crew's power in very visible terms and expressed the crewsmen's desires to elevate their members to a revered status. It marked the court as accomplished enough to attain a status in a hierarchy within a hierarchy. So here is a reconstruction of a Grand March in a 19th century ball, because all respectable balls in the 19th century opened with a Grand March. So just imagine that instead of wearing late 19th century ball gowns, these people are wearing this. Okay, you got your imagination hats on? Here we go. What we'll see is that you'll see a lot of geometrical patterns, and it's from up top. Couples who, if you watch Jane Austen movies, for instance, they come to the end of the line and then they cast off. It's long ways for as many will. We can make our own Grand March if it comes to it. We have enough. Then they start weaving together until everybody gets back to the same place, and then they start a new pattern. So a lot of what I have to do is I'm a detective. Firstly, I'm a detective because you don't know who's in the crew, supposedly, because it's all, everyone's masked, it's super secretive. So you find out who's in the crew by seeing who the women were published in the newspaper the next day as queens and maids, and then, well, who are their fathers, who are their cousins. You link that to family histories, and you go that way. And you see where are they going to school, and then who are their dancing masters. And then you can read the dancing manuals that the dancing masters publish or have read, or these kinds. So you trace these kinds of routes and routes. And then also it was like reading Vogue or Cosmo during the day. Dancing manuals were ubiquitous among the upper middle class and the upper class in America. And so you had, even for doing a curtsy, there were no less than 11 movements that you had to do, and they had to be pretty standardized across most parts of the, at least, East Coast. And a lot of these girls went on, some of them married Boss Tweed's daughters, sons. Yes, sons. Some of the women married Boss Tweed's sons. Some married real-life royalty. They summered with the Vanderbilts. So they had to have they had to be congruent with that bodily knowledge, right? So if you look in the most famous dancing manuals, you'll see that a lot of the movement language had already come from England, France, mostly, a little bit from Spain, but had been here for long enough that it had been standardized, mostly in New York, a little bit in San Francisco. They were doing other things out there, though. They give us ragtime after a little bit. So things were pretty standardized in American ways, and there was a little bit of flow back and forth. But in the 1840s, we were more concerned with what were the royal courts doing in Europe. But by the 1880s and 90s, it was more that the South was concerned about what was the North doing in, like going to the Astors for their opera season, for instance. But we had dancing manuals that everyone would subscribe to and standardize, right? So maybe we can get on the internet in a little bit, but for the sake of time, what I'll do is go ahead and move on so that you can see what some of the other dancing look like. Because I do have pictures, and at the very least, I don't know if this is going to throw them off. Okay, so for instance, after the Grand March, the kings and queens, I mean, that's what they had to do. They had the Grand March where they were presented to everyone, hello, here I am, and then they would retire to the throne on stage for the rest of the evening. But the maids and the dukes could go and do the royal maskers dances. So they still had this chance to prove their worth, so to speak. And that's what they did. So the royal maskers dances were mostly quadrilles, and it was the lancers' quadrilles that was very important for the old line crews, and that came from France, and mostly from Louis XIV's court, which was always a big deal to tie anything you did to Louis XIV's court, even though most of the old line crewsmen did not come from France. So that's really interesting. But the quadrille, what it did was it emphasized hierarchy, but also stability. So the royal maskers dances through the quadrille it was another way to show status symbol, because it allowed the cream of society to stand apart as refined dancers, but it also created a space for them to mingle with each other, because you were expected to have polite conversation while you danced with each other. And only the highest ranking guests, and so here at the balls that meant the royalty, were allowed to dance the first quadrilles at the ball. So the Library of Congress has some phenomenal dance historians, and they recreated from dance manuals that they have from 1492, which is an unfortunate catalog, but that's when they started, all the way into the 1930s. They have hundreds and hundreds of dance manuals, and they're all online. And they recreated some of the most popular dances, and they're online. So, roll! Take it away! So here's the casting off. And this is great, because we are the most esteemed guests in the first balcony watching. Can you see? Yes? Okay. I love tubas. They're so funny. The second video is... It's a Lancer's quadrille. Oh, yes. Yes, that's it. That's it. Oh, you're awesome. Thank you. When I show my classes, sometimes it's hard not to go. Which would definitely get me kicked out of the ball. In fact, if you're not wearing gloves, if you're not wearing to-the-floor ball gown, you had to be scrupulously attired. No tuxes, only white tails. So you see that in order to imagine carrying around So imagine walking around for this length of time and being dressed as a king or a queen with an entire train behind you of ermine and jewels, and having a crown and a scepter, and still needing to be upright. Bows and curtsies to end, and to the group.
Who's watching that?
Who would be watching that? So in a ball, in a society ball, only the highest ranking social guests would do that, so then everyone else would.
I didn't see anybody else.
Oh, so yeah, in the video there are people who flank the sides. They're just out of view because the camera zoomed in on the dancers. But so, for instance, George Washington was a consummate dancer. He loved to dance, and he was spectacular at it. And so any ball he went to, people were like, dang it, there goes us being able to open the ball, you know, because he would always then take first place. So then we also have the quadrille. Yes, please, and thank you. So the Lancers quadrille. And this, it shows you the geometric patterns and also the fact that they were expected to chat a little bit. It's a walking dance, but there's a lot of changes. They make a square, they always come back to it. Again, the formality, but the stability. They definitely took dancing lessons. Those hops turn into polka waltzes, which later lead into other types of waltzes, and then ragtime. Little chat here, little chat there. How's the weather, Susan? It's very nice, Claude. Thank you. I think this might be a good place to stop the video. Thank you. It goes on with different changes and patterns. Yes?
So was someone essentially calling out what they were going to move to next? Or?
Well, for social dances, there might be a caller. If you were at, for instance, a subscription ball, they would have callers. But for the carnival ball, after a while, women knew if they were on the court. They would find out on Christmas Eve or New Year's Day, depending on which crew they were a member of or their father was a member of. And then they had a few weeks to prepare, right? But also they were taking comportment and deportment lessons their whole life, and they were in dance class, and that was a part of their school training, as a matter of fact. You know, how to sit, how to stand, how to faint. Delsartism, but also social dance classes. So they knew many different, they're called sets of Lancers, so it's just a matter of figuring out which different order they were going to go into. And the Lancers were, by this point, this is actually much simpler than even a decade before, which was so. They knew what to expect generally. It was just a matter of going, okay, we're going to do the S, then the Z, then the 4, then the 3. Yeah. So what the Lancers offered then for them was, in very visible terms, again, that we did that, the physical formality, that these gentle gliding patterns and geometrically interweaving couples with the space of the square that we saw, it emphasized this dignity within the community as well, so that the participation signified this honored status, but really what was important here is this sense of belonging, right? And that sense of belonging becomes really, really important for the court women. Because while the men are masked from head to toe, the women were unmasked. So their identity was apparent to guests at all times. So their inclusion was, of course, tied to their father's reputation, but also their inclusion on courts tied status and conferred status directly upon them. So how well they danced mattered in conferring not only status on them, but also in developing a reputation. Young socialites became carnival queens essentially when they were still girls. Queenhood ended their adolescence because society expected a Krewe queen or a maid to become a wife and then a mother. These parts were as scripted as their scepter waves, right? And Krewe courts could often and did double as marriage markets. So daughters knew that they were engaged in a very serious business. But they weren't pawns. I know, Leda Hinks, right? They weren't pawns in this game. How they physicalized their court roles through dancing was a very important choice for them as women. So through their regal promenades and their courtly and stately quadrille dances, the proper wave or curtsy physically symbolized a strong demonstration on the dependability and continuity of women's contributions to old line Krewe life, not just to men's. So where this all comes together, naturally enough, is on the dance floor in ballroom dancing. So while Reconstruction, as we talked about, was very male-centric with those tableau performances and were extremely political in nature, and then the Gilded Age, as we just saw, were focused on grand marches and maskers' dances where courts and women, debutantes took the spotlight. Moving into the turn of the century, firmly planted in the progressive era, men and women met face to face on the dance floor for the closing part of the ball, when the dance floor opened up for what we call general dancing. This is a dance card, and the dance cards were always keepsakes for the women who got them. They always had a pencil attached, and they could double as other kinds of, they always had the annual theme. So there's the wolf running off with the babies, and you'll see the next card is also a fan, in case the ladies got too excited by the dancing. So like tableaux vivants and court marches, ballroom dancing enabled old line Krewes to preserve traditional values and script these utopian gender values and identities that they had been playing out in other parts of the ball. But here they could also test the limits of those dictums. And that becomes really important because they do that by embracing the latest national dance crazes. And by far the most popular one was the waltz. And you might not be able to see it here, and this is the fan I was talking about. But there's like waltz, polka, waltz, 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 gallop, which is a kind of polka. There are lancers up at the top, just for those old fuddy-duddy royal people, and lots more waltzes and another lancers thrown in just in case you want to feel special. So the waltzes were by far the most popular dances early on that people wanted to engage in. And waltzing was popular because it was whirling, it was heart-pumping excitement. It only really required stepping with a partner in concentric circles. And most importantly, it allowed couples to easily learn how to move together harmoniously and passionately. Waltzing provided idealized physicality on the dance floor for testing partnerships outside of the carnival ball. They had a parade and then they went back and did all of this, right? They had a lot of energy, much more than me.
So did a man from one Krewe and a woman from a different Krewe ever intermarry?
They did. And there were certain families that intermarried, were known to intermarry, and they formed dynasties so that they made sure that their children were always the most, that's not good grammar, but they were on the courts the most throughout the generations, and they were essentially the leaders of the leaders. And you saw them more than anyone else.
Did they form a different Krewe, or how did that work?
Well, there were these old line crews, and then their sons formed probably 5 or 6 of the Tableaux societies, and all of those stayed within the same families. And then right after, I would say, World War I, middle class people had been going to see all these parades, were like, hey, that looks kind of fun. And now we're starting to get cars of our own. You know, we could decorate our cars and go down the street. And so they started to make their own crews. And some of the women from these crews were like, you know, it might be fun if we every once in a while, maybe on leap year, just kind of flipped the script and had you boys come and we're going to dress up. And so there were a few women's crews, but they didn't last very long until the 1930s about. So it was really after World War I was a watershed moment that shifted the economy and shifted the class system and the availability. And that's when more and more crews started to organize. But these crews still maintained a hold in a certain way and still do. Does that answer your question? So you'll see this is not the Viennese waltz, but this is the American waltz in the late 19th century. It's bouncy too because it grew out of the polka right after the Civil War.
Mardi Gras that we see today is huge multi-day parades.
Yes.
That wasn't true back then?
No, at the turn of the century, the only parades that you would see were the old line crews. It was after World War I when you started to see neighborhood parades, and then in the 40s and 50s you started to see more and more parades, but the super crews, as they're called, that you see today, like Endymion, they started to come out in the 60s and 70s.
This was really closed off to everyone else.
Right, so everyone in the city would flock to see these 6 crews parade. So there were just about 6 crews. Now, let me say, if there's something that you've noticed, these crews are all white. It's not like there was just white Mardi Gras, right? So if you read the book, part of what it says is that they are creating Mardi Gras in response to racialized tensions. And so there's a whole other Mardi Gras that they are saying, oh gosh. And so that Mardi Gras is the Mardi Gras of Mardi Gras Indians, of baby dolls. But it happens not in the French Quarter. Right? It doesn't happen on Canal Street. It happens in Treme. It happens uptown, and all of the neighborhoods that are extremely vibrant, right? But what they do is try to formalize and modernize Mardi Gras in a way that says we're going to control what's going on, right? So there are many different Mardi Gras that are simultaneously and have always been happening, and this is just one kind. But the public Mardi Gras parades that go throughout the city on parade routes, there were just these 6 that people really knew about. And then after World War I, there started to become more and more as the economy changed and as it became more available that people had their own cars and were able to decorate them. And then people were like, wait, why is that only a couple of organizations should have all of this opportunity? Why don't we just make our own crews? And so then the landscape started to really shift, right? And part of that was a generational shift. Even within the crews. So even within the crews, there was tension over this formality and control. That the waltz was fine and everything, except for the younger generation who were like, you know, Dad, we go to these balls, we have a good time doing the waltz, but then on the weekends we are out there doing ragtime all day long. And Dad is like, we're just not going to have ragtime at the ball. And Son is like, are you sure though? Are you sure? And ragtime was everywhere. You couldn't stop it from happening. And a lot of Mardi Gras historians say, you know what, ragtime didn't exist in the balls, but actually it did. And so what ragtime was that it was, where am I here? Syncopated, fast style movement that brought partners even closer together than the waltz did. And the reigning ragtime champions were animal dances. So you've probably heard of these. The turkey trot, the bunny hug, the grizzly bear, among many, many others. And they incorporated these one-step movements with breakaways so partners could dance on their own for a second, which was crazy, right? They had periodic jumps interspersed with arm flailing, full body jerks. It's where we start to get this, and this, and this. Everything that comes from the 20th century social dancing evolves out of ragtime. I have an example of the grizzly bear. Maybe we'll look at it a little bit later. But what happens is that on a national level, social reformers become very nervous because there's a schism between the class system, of course. We have the upper class who is like, no, we want to keep waltzing. And then we have the younger generation and the working class and the middle class who is like, it's okay to move our bodies. We're still morally okay with all of this. And so the American youth, even younger Krewesmen, didn't stop ragging. But what they did do was they looked to tamer versions that began to proliferate to meet the middle and upper class standards that reformers were looking for. And for the old line balls, this meant the one step. And this is Vernon and Irene Castle, who were the king and queen of showing us those tamer versions that everybody wanted to dance, right? So the one step was great because it offered this physical and ideological compromise. So on both fronts, right? It moved in this fast-paced tempo of rag dancing that really thrilled the youth, while it also had this more modest movement vocabulary that was just right for the dads and that the older generation sought. So ragtime, what it did was it breathed this new life into crew rituals and romances. And I think this is a short video and it's probably worth watching for the 30 seconds so that you see the dynamic shift from the waltz to this. Do you think we could pull it up? It's on YouTube, likely. There was a man named Wiley Knight. He came down on the train from Chicago and opened up a dancing school for the middle and upper class African Americans in New Orleans. And what he did was he brought with him a dance called the Chicago Glide. It was a waltz version. And then everyone who danced there opened up a crew. And that was the only African American crew, and they danced a waltz version. And it was very different that no one sat up in balconies. Everyone sat on the same floor. Everyone ate food together. Everyone danced the whole time together. And then performances were very call and response participatory. So that was the only crew, and I talk about it in my book.
What's going on in the rest of the states?
In the rest of the states, well, in the rest of the states, so that is actually something, I'm not being silly here. That is actually what the thrust of my book is about. What it does is, instead of, like a lot of New Orleans histories are always this romantic kind of manifest destiny, uniqueness, about New Orleans. Great. I love New Orleans. It really is awesome, but also it's a part of a context, right? So if we're looking at what's going on in New Orleans, what's unique about it is that no one else celebrates Mardi Gras in this way. And it really is a rich cultural heritage. But again, it's part of the nexus, right? So what the Old Line crews are doing isn't something unique. It's in response to something. For instance, it's in response to the Mardi Gras Indians, to jazz funerals, but also to national attitudes, right? So a lot of what the pageant themes are during Reconstruction are about politics, or a lot of the themes that, or a lot of what their tableaus are, have to do actually with American ideas. So in the book, I don't just talk about the micro local history, but how does what they're performing talk about generational shifts in the idea of American identity. So it's, as far as Ragtime, what they're going through is very much on par with what America is going through in the 19-teens. Like, Henry Luce ends up writing that we could be the great generation. You know, the Beats kind of picked this up after the war. Like, what are we doing? As long as we ask ourselves, what are we doing? Are we holding ourselves to the potential that we have? We can be the great generation and be world leaders. And ragtime dance is one of those ways to look through the body and ask ourselves just that. Because ragtime dance comes from San Francisco, and it comes from New York City, but embroiled in that are lots of issues about class and race and gender, but the nature of what it means to be American. And so whether people accepted it or rejected it or thought, oh, let's think about it and use it, and what does it mean to dance it and connect through it, made, I think, differences based on location as to how people answer that question. So I know that's pretty vague, but there's so much scholarship out there that has specific answers based on when exactly and where. So, so this is the tamer version that they went with. So what this tamer version does is tell us that this general dancing, especially in the 19-teens, allowed Krewes and their families and guests to do something that was previously impossible. It allowed them to make these decisions about where and how they fit into the context of America and of New Orleans itself, but even more importantly, it allowed them to adapt. While Krewes embraced the past in tableau and court presentations, to solidify a sense of togetherness, the general dancing section of the ball embraced the present. And through flirtations, possibilities of the future. With the coming of World War I and the many lasting economic, cultural, and social shifts, some of which we've talked about, that the war wrought, through dancing, even the syncopated styles of ragtime, Krewesmen and their guests were finally in sync. Thank you.